December 16, 1944. In the frozen Ardennes Forest, 200,000 German soldiers and 1,000 tanks smash into the weakest sector of the American front line. The intelligence services of the Allied High Command have failed completely. The German offensive has achieved total surprise. One American general stands directly in the path of this massive onslaught, but he is not George Patton. He is not Omar Bradley. He is not even a name you have ever heard. He is a quiet, unassuming soldier who has spent his entire career avoiding the spotlight. And when the German assault threatens to split the Allied armies in half, this forgotten commander must make a decision that will determine the fate of the entire European campaign. Who was this man? And why did history bury him while celebrating Patton? His name was Courtney H. Hodges, and if you have never heard of him, that is precisely the point. Born in Perry, Georgia in 1887, Hodges was the son of a local newspaper publisher. His path to military greatness was anything but conventional. In 1904, he secured an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was the dream of every ambitious young American officer. But within 1 year, Hodges failed mathematics and was forced to resign. The academy had judged him, and it had found him wanting. But Hodges refused to accept this verdict. He enlisted in the regular army as a private soldier in 1906. It was a humbling step for a young man who had once dreamed of graduating from West Point. Yet this decision revealed something essential about Hodges. He was patient, determined, and indifferent to status. He worked his way up through the ranks with quiet efficiency. Within 3 years, he had earned a second lieutenant's commission. He was what the military called a Mustang, an officer who had risen from the enlisted ranks. These men were often respected for their practical knowledge, but rarely celebrated for their brilliance. Hodges served under General John J. Pershing during the 1916 punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in Mexico. It was harsh, unforgiving terrain, and it tested every soldier who served there. He carried those lessons to the battlefields of France during the First World War, where he commanded a battalion of the 6th Infantry Regiment, 5th Division. During the Meuse River Offensive in November 1918, Hodges personally led a reconnaissance patrol under enemy fire. It was the kind of courage that could have made him famous. But he never sought attention. He simply did his duty and moved on. Between the wars, Hodges remained in the Army during a period of severe budget cuts and limited opportunities. In 1920, he returned to West Point, this time as an instructor in the tactics department. It was a deeply ironic twist. The man who had failed at West Point was now teaching its future officers how to fight. Among his students was a younger officer named Omar Bradley. The two men formed a close friendship that would last for decades. Bradley later recalled that Hodges was an inspiration to the class that had once rejected him. Hodges and Bradley shared something deeper than professional respect. They shared a vision of what the American Army should become. Both believed in preparation, training, and careful planning. Neither was given to the kind of theatrical grandstanding that would later make George Patton famous. They were quiet professionals who believed that war was a business of calculation, not emotion. When the United States entered the Second World War, Hodges was promoted to Major General and given command of the 3rd Army Corps. He demonstrated a keen understanding of mechanized warfare, overseeing the development of weapons such as the bazooka and the Jeep. In 1943, he was sent to England to prepare for the greatest military operation in history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Hodges served as Omar Bradley's deputy in command of the U.S. First Army. It was Bradley who received the headlines. It was Hodges who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the invasion's success. When Bradley was promoted to command the 12th Army Group in August 1944, Hodges assumed full command of the First Army. He led it through the Mons Pocket, the liberation of Paris, the breaching of the Siegfried Line, and the capture of Aachen. It was a remarkable string of victories. But Hodges received almost none of the credit. Why did history ignore him? The answer lies in his character. Hodges was almost painfully shy. He avoided photographers and journalists. He gave few interviews and refused to cultivate the kind of larger-than-life persona that Patton embraced so eagerly. When reporters asked for comments, Hodges often directed them to his subordinates. He believed that soldiers should be seen as a team, not as individuals seeking glory. It was an honorable position, but it was a disastrous choice for anyone hoping to be remembered. There was another reason for Hodges' obscurity. In the autumn of 1944, his army suffered a brutal ordeal in the Ardennes Forest. It was one of the most grueling and costly battles of the entire war. Over 5,000 men of the 28th Infantry Division alone became casualties in a matter of days. Hodges was fiercely criticized for ordering frontal assaults against heavily fortified German positions. Historians have debated this decision for decades. Some argue that he was needlessly stubborn. Others insist that he was simply following the operational logic of the time, attempting to maintain pressure on the German defenses to prevent them from reinforcing other sectors. What cannot be denied is this. By December 1944, the First Army was exhausted. Its units had been bled white in the Ardennes Forest. Its divisions were scattered across a long, thinly held front line that stretched through the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Ardennes was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place where worn-out divisions could rest and refit. The Americans had only 4 divisions covering the entire area. Hodges was confident that the Germans were too weak to launch a serious offensive. He ignored warnings from his intelligence officer, Colonel Monach Dixon, who had correctly predicted that the Germans were preparing a major counterattack. Why did Hodges ignore these warnings? That question haunted him for the rest of his career. He had received detailed intelligence from the British and American intelligence services that the Germans were building up forces opposite his front. But Hodges was not alone in his skepticism. The entire Allied command structure underestimated German resilience. Many assumed that the German army was on the verge of collapse. Any intelligence that suggested otherwise was treated with suspicion. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the morning silence was shattered by the roar of nearly 2,000 German artillery pieces. The entire front line erupted in a storm of high explosive and shrapnel. The German offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was the last great gamble of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. It involved 3 full armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and the 7th Army. Together they numbered nearly 200,000 soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks and assault guns. The weight of the attack fell on Hodges' First Army, the 106th Infantry Division. A newly arrived formation that had been sent to the quiet sector for training was utterly overwhelmed. In the freezing fog and driving snow, German soldiers poured through the American lines. Communication lines were cut within hours. The 106th Division's 2 regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, were quickly surrounded and cut off. Within days, more than 7,000 American soldiers surrendered, the worst battlefield defeat for U.S. forces in the European theater since the Battle of the Bulge itself. Hodges' initial reaction was one of stunned disbelief. His staff reported massive penetrations across the entire front. The German 6th Panzer Army was driving hard for the Elsenborn Ridge, a critical high ground that commanded the northern approach to the Meuse River. If the Germans crossed the Meuse, they could reach the vital supply ports of Antwerp and divide the Allied armies in 2. It was the nightmare scenario that Allied commanders had feared since the Normandy invasion. Hodges faced an impossible situation. His front was collapsing on multiple sectors. His reserves were already committed to plugging the gaps. The weather was terrible, preventing any Allied air support. The Germans were moving with terrifying speed, and to make matters worse, Hodges could not get reliable information about the situation. His headquarters in the Belgian town of Spy was receiving conflicting reports from every direction. Some units were already in full retreat. Others were holding their positions against overwhelming odds. In his headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Staff officers rushed in and out with reports from the front. Maps were covered in red and blue markers, indicating German penetrations in American positions. Hodges stood at the center of this chaos, studying the situation with calm concentration. He knew that if he ordered a general retreat to the Meuse River, his units might survive, but the Germans would break through and win the battle. If he ordered his men to hold their positions, they might be surrounded and destroyed. There was no easy choice. Then came the most controversial decision of his career. General Omar Bradley, his old friend and superior, called and ordered him to withdraw his forces to the Meuse River. It was the logical response to a catastrophic breach, but Hodges refused. He insisted that his army could hold the northern shoulder of the German penetration. He argued that the key to the battle was the high ground around Elsenborn Ridge and the road junction at St. Vith. If the Americans held these positions, They could slow the German advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. If they abandoned them, the Germans would have clear roads to the Meuse and beyond. Bradley was furious. He had never known Hodges to be so stubborn, but Hodges had a clear vision of the terrain. He understood that the Ardennes was a region of dense forests, steep ridges, and narrow roads. A retreat to the Meuse would surrender the best defensive positions to the Germans and open the floodgates to their panzer divisions. It would be a disastrous retreat, a get-out-of-the-way order that the American army had become famous for avoiding. There was another reason for Hodges' defiance. He had made a promise to his troops during the Normandy campaign. He had told them that he would never order them to retreat if he believed that victory could be achieved by holding their ground. It was a simple promise, but one that he took seriously. He was willing to risk his career to keep it, and so Hodges gave the order: no general retreat. The First Army would hold its positions, reorganize its defenses, and fight. He withdrew his reserves, the veteran 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions, from the northern sector and repositioned them on the Elsenborn Ridge. He ordered the 7th Armored Division to defend the critical road junction at Vith. He commanded the 101st Airborne Division, yes, the famous Screaming Eagles, to reinforce the southern sector around Bastogne. It was a desperate gamble. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The German plan depended on speed. Hitler had demanded that the panzer divisions reach the Meuse River within 3 days. They were supposed to use the excellent road network to drive straight through the Ardennes and achieve total surprise. But Hodges' decisions disrupted every element of that plan. On the Elsenborn Ridge, the 99th Infantry Division, a unit so inexperienced that it had never seen combat before, fought with extraordinary bravery against the German 6th Panzer Army. They were supported by the veteran 2nd Infantry Division, which had been pulled from the line and was preparing for a rest. Now they were being thrown back into battle. The Germans expected a weak defense, but they found a wall of fire. The ground itself became an unexpected ally. The ridge offered clear fields of fire that the American artillery exploited. When the German panzer divisions attempted to break through, they found their vehicles advancing through frozen mud and snow-covered fields, making them easy targets for American anti-tank guns. The Germans were forced to advance along narrow roads that were easily blocked by American demolition teams. The 99th Infantry Division's commander, Major General Walter Lauer, described the scene to his staff. "We're holding the line. They're coming in waves, but they're not breaking through." Lauer's men were young, many of them teenagers who had never been in combat before. They fought with a ferocity that shocked the Germans. When one sergeant was asked how he could stand against an entire panzer army, he replied simply, "Because my captain told me to." For 3 days, the Elsenborn Ridge held. The German 6th Panzer Army, which had been expected to reach the Meuse within 48 hours, was still stuck at the northern shoulder of the Ardennes. The road network was clogged with their own vehicles. They had no choice but to bypass the ridge and take secondary roads to the south. Those roads were narrow, winding, and barely passable for heavy armor. The Germans had lost their momentum. Meanwhile, on the road junction at Vith, the 7th Armored Division was fighting a desperate holding action. The city lay at the intersection of 5 major highways. Whoever controlled Vith controlled the entire northern sector of the Ardennes. The commander of the 7th Armored, Brigadier General Bruce Clark, had been ordered by Hodges to hold the city as long as possible. It was a vague order, but Clark understood its meaning. He knew that his division was badly outnumbered. He knew that his men would take heavy casualties, but he also knew that his sacrifice would buy time for the Allies to reorganize. Clark established a series of defensive positions around the city. He used hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and minefields to slow the German advance. His tanks would fire from concealed positions, then withdraw before the Germans could return fire. It was a clever, flexible defense that frustrated the German commanders. They had expected a quick victory. Instead, they were fighting a bitter attrition battle that was destroying their timetable. But Hodges' stand was not without a cost. The Americans suffered enormous casualties. The 106th Infantry Division was effectively destroyed. The 28th Infantry Division took heavy losses in its desperate defense of the southern sectors. And in Vith, Clark's division was so badly battered that it had to withdraw to avoid being surrounded. The American official history of the battle, written by historian Hugh M. Cole, describes the situation in Vith as one of the most desperate battles fought by the American Army during the entire war. The Germans could not understand why the Americans were able to hold out against overwhelming odds. But Hodges had given them something more than material support. He had given them a reason to fight. While Hodges' men fought for their lives, the American command structure erupted in a crisis of communication. For 3 days, Bradley could not make reliable contact with Hodges. German units had cut the telephone lines and radio communications. Bradley had no idea what was happening at the northern shoulder. He could only receive fragmentary messages, many of them outdated by the time they reached him. On December 18th, Hodges faced another crisis. His headquarters at Spa was now within range of German artillery. The Germans were advancing toward the town from the south, and Hodges had to make a painful decision. He would have to evacuate his headquarters. But moving a command post in the middle of a battle is a nightmare. Communication lines would have to be reestablished. Staff officers would have to relocate, and critical equipment would have to be packed and transported under fire. Hodges ordered his men to begin the evacuation, but he hesitated. He knew that if he left his headquarters, he would lose contact with his frontline units for hours. The risk was enormous. He could not control the battle from a moving convoy. He decided to stay in Spa until his staff could find a secure location. For a few anxious hours, the First Army's command structure was effectively paralyzed. Then, on December 19th, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a controversial decision. He concluded that the Allied lines were effectively split in two. Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg could no longer exercise effective control over the northern sector. Eisenhower decided to transfer control of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would now command the northern flank of the Ardennes. This decision infuriated Bradley and Patton. Bradley considered it a humiliating slap in the face. Patton wrote in his diary that the British had stolen command of the Americans. The American generals viewed Montgomery as arrogant, cautious, and desperate to claim credit for their victories. But Eisenhower had made the decision based on operational necessity, not national pride. Hodges received the news with characteristic silence. He was a soldier who obeyed orders without complaint. If Eisenhower wanted Montgomery to command his army, then he would work with Montgomery. It was that simple for him. But privately, Hodges had grave doubts about Montgomery's leadership style. Montgomery was a cautious commander. He preferred to regroup and strike methodically rather than launching immediate counterattacks. Hodges, despite his quiet demeanor, was actually more aggressive than Montgomery in situations where speed was essential. Montgomery quickly demonstrated his cautious nature. He proposed a general withdrawal of Hodges' First Army to the Meuse River. It was the same order that Bradley had given, and the same order that Hodges had refused. Now Montgomery was repeating it. For Hodges, it was a moment of profound tension. He had defied a 4-star general in Bradley. Could he defy a 5-star field marshal? Hodges did not refuse Montgomery directly. Instead, he explained his position in clear, factual terms. He argued that any withdrawal would surrender the defensive positions at Elsenborn and St. Vith, which were still holding. He insisted that the First Army could continue its defense. He simply would not retreat unless the situation became absolutely desperate. Montgomery, despite his cautious reputation, recognized the logic of Hodges' position. He allowed the First Army to maintain its current defensive lines, provided that the units could be withdrawn if the Germans made a major breakthrough. Hodges' calculated defiance had worked against two of the most powerful commanders in the Allied war effort. As the days passed, Hodges showed signs of exhaustion. He had been working nearly around the clock since December 16th. His face was gaunt, his eyes were sunken. He barely ate or slept. His staff watched him with growing concern, but they could not persuade him to rest. He had taken personal responsibility for the entire defensive operation, and he refused to delegate any critical decision. Eisenhower visited Hodges' new headquarters on December 20th. The Supreme Commander was concerned by the reports of Hodges' physical condition. When Eisenhower arrived, he found Hodges standing over the map table, his hands trembling slightly from fatigue. There was something tragic in this image, a tired, worn-down soldier holding an army together through sheer force of will. Eisenhower later wrote in his memoirs, Crusade in Europe, "Hodges was one of the most competent professional soldiers I ever commanded. He possessed that rare quality of calm judgment that never failed him, even in the most critical moments. Eisenhower knew that Hodges' defensive stand was the key to the entire battle. If the northern shoulder had broken, the Germans would have reached the Meuse. That would have cut the American army in half and allowed the Germans to fight a defensive war on their own terms. But the strain was becoming unbearable. Hodges now faced a new threat. On December 21st, the German 5th Panzer Army launched a major offensive against the southern sector, driving toward the village of Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, which Hodges had dispatched to the south, was now trapped and surrounded. The siege of Bastogne had begun. Hodges could do little to help them. His own forces were still fighting desperately on the northern shoulder. The fate of the entire battle now hung in the balance. As the German offensive reached its climax, the tension in Hodges' headquarters was almost unbearable. He had done everything possible to stop the German advance. He had sacrificed thousands of his men. He had defied his superiors. He had held his ground when everyone was telling him to retreat. But still, the Germans continued to advance. On December 23rd, the weather began to improve. The thick clouds and fog that had grounded the Allied air forces for a full week started to clear. This was a crucial turning point. As the skies cleared, the American and British fighters and fighter bombers could finally fly over the battlefield. They began to attack the German columns, slowing their advance and destroying their supply lines. Hodges knew that air power alone would not win the battle. He needed ground reinforcements, and the only ground reinforcements available were George Patton's Third Army, which was fighting in the south. But Patton was a world away, fighting his own battles. There was no sign that he was coming north. Then on December 25th, Christmas Day, Hodges received word from Eisenhower that Patton would launch a relief offensive against the German southern flank. Patton's corps would cut the roads leading to Bastogne and relieve the 101st Airborne. But Hodges knew that Patton's offensive would take time. He had to hold his position for at least another week. He had to keep the northern shoulder intact, no matter what. Christmas Day, 1944. While the rest of the Western world celebrated peace and hope, the Ardennes remained a frozen hell of death and desperation. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges had now been fighting for 9 consecutive days without meaningful rest. His body was giving out. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled when he reached for reports. But his mind remained sharp, and his determination never wavered. The crisis was far from over. The Germans, despite their failure to break through the northern shoulder, were still advancing in the south. Bastogne remained surrounded. Patton's Third Army was moving north, but it would take days for his forces to reach the besieged paratroopers. In the meantime, Hodges had to keep the northern sector stable. He could not allow the Germans to reinforce their southern offensive with troops from the north. If the Elsenborn Ridge finally collapsed, the entire Allied line would disintegrate. The daily reality of command was crushing. Hodges had to make decisions that sent hundreds of men to their deaths. He had to refuse pleas for reinforcements from exhausted battalion commanders. He had to order withdrawals when units were about to be surrounded. He had to endure the quiet resentment of officers who believed he was sacrificing them needlessly. It was the loneliest job in the American military. One of the most painful aspects of Hodges' situation was his relationship with his old friend, Omar Bradley. The two men had been close for more than 2 decades. They had shared meals, hunting trips, and long conversations about the future of the American Army. Bradley had been the best man at Hodges' wedding. They were more than colleagues. They were brothers in arms. And now Bradley was angry with him. Why? Because Bradley believed that Hodges had undermined his authority. Hodges had refused Bradley's order to retreat to the Meuse. He had then convinced Montgomery to approve his stand. From Bradley's perspective, Hodges had gone behind his back. From Hodges' perspective, he had simply done what was necessary to win the battle. The breach between the two men would never fully heal. Hodges never spoke publicly about the rift, but those close to him noted the sadness in his eyes whenever Bradley's name was mentioned. The historian Forrest Pogue, who interviewed Hodges after the war, described the general's reaction to the breakdown of his friendship with Bradley. Hodges told Pogue, "When the battle was over, I thought we could talk about it, but he never wanted to talk about it. He just seemed to move on, and I let it go because that's the kind of person I am." It was a quiet, devastating admission from a man who had given everything to the Army and had received so little in return. The specter of Patton had been haunting Hodges since the beginning of the crisis. George S. Patton was everything that Hodges was not. Patton was theatrical, aggressive, and relentlessly self-promoting. He courted journalists. He delivered stirring speeches to his troops. He wore ivory-handled pistols and insisted on being photographed in dramatic poses. He was a celebrity, and he loved every moment of it. Patton's relationship with Hodges was always complicated. The two men held fundamentally different views of warfare. Patton believed in aggressive, decisive action. He favored armored breakthroughs and deep penetrations into enemy territory. Hodges, by contrast, was a methodical soldier. He believed in careful planning, reconnaissance, and overwhelming firepower. He did not believe in taking unnecessary risks. To Patton, Hodges was cautious to the point of hesitation. To Hodges, Patton was reckless to the point of carelessness. The tension between them became painfully visible during the Ardennes crisis. Patton, from his headquarters, watched the northern sector with growing frustration. He believed that Hodges was too passive. He thought the First Army should be launching immediate counterattacks instead of simply holding the line. In his diary, Patton wrote that Hodges was a solid but uninspired commander who seems to be doing little more than reacting. He also noted that the First Army appears to be in a state of confusion and panic. Hodges knew that Patton was criticizing him. He read the intelligence reports from the South. He understood Patton's pressure on Eisenhower and Bradley, but Hodges refused to be drawn into a public argument. He simply continued to do his duty. He would not sacrifice his army's position to satisfy Patton's ego. He would not order unnecessary counterattacks that would bleed his men dry. He would fight his own battle on his own terms. But that did not mean that Hodges was ignoring the Southern threat. Far from it. Hodges understood that the success of Patton's relief offensive depended on his own ability to hold the northern shoulder. If the Germans broke through the north, they would be free to launch a counterattack against Patton's exposed flank. The Third Army would be caught between German forces and destroyed. Hodges' defense was essential to Patton's success, and yet Patton never publicly acknowledged this. In his memoirs, War as I Knew It, Patton praised the bravery of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. He praised his own soldiers for their incredible effort in marching through snow and ice. But he barely mentioned Hodges or the First Army. It was a devastating omission that historians have noted ever since. Was Patton's silence intentional? Or was it simply the result of his overwhelming focus on his own battles? It is impossible to know for certain. But what is clear is that Patton's version of events became the accepted story. The relief of Bastogne, the dramatic images of Patton's tanks racing through the snow, these became the symbols of American courage in the Battle of the Bulge. The First Army's desperate defense was relegated to the footnotes. By December the 26th, the German offensive had reached its maximum penetration. The 6th Panzer Army was still hammering at the Elsenborn Ridge, but it had been unable to break through. The 5th Panzer Army had reached the Meuse River at a few points, but the British had reinforced the river crossings and prevented a crossing. The 7th Army, the weakest of the three, had been stopped cold by the American defenses. But the Germans were not finished. On December 27th, they launched a new offensive against the northern sector, using their last reserves. It was a desperate gamble, but it was also a dangerous one. If the Germans could break through the First Army's lines, they could still reach Antwerp. Hodges was under enormous pressure. His men were exhausted, ammunition was running low, and the weather had turned cold again, making their positions almost impossible to defend. Hodges knew that he was at the breaking point. He had already used every reserve division available to him. He had pulled men from non-combat positions and sent them to the front. He had reduced his headquarters staff to the absolute minimum to save every able-bodied soldier for the line. He could not reinforce his position any further. And then on December 28th, it all came down to one decision. Hodges received word that the German 6th Panzer Army was assembling its last reserves for a final assault against the Elsenborn Ridge. The Germans were going to throw everything they had at his strongest position. If they succeeded, the northern shoulder would collapse, and the Germans would flood through the gap. Hodges called his commanders together for a final consultation. He told them, "Gentlemen, the battle is not yet won. The Germans are preparing a major assault against the Elsenborn Ridge. We must hold that ridge. If we lose it, we lose the whole battle. There will be no retreat. We fight to the last round, the last man, and the last position. It was a desperate order. It was also a brilliant one. Hodges had correctly read the German psychology. They were committing their last reserves to a single, decisive attack. If that attack failed, the Germans would have no more offensive power left. The battle would be won. But if the attack succeeded, the Allies would be forced to withdraw and regroup. The German assault came on December 29th. It was preceded by a massive artillery barrage. Thousands of rounds rained down on the American positions. Then, the Panzer divisions, supported by the last of the German infantry, advanced across the frozen ground. The Americans waited until the Germans were within 200 yards, then opened fire with every weapon they had. Machine guns, artillery, mortars, anti-tank guns, all of them fired at once. The German lines were shredded by the murderous firepower. The tanks were targeted by American bazookas and anti-tank guns. The infantry was cut down by machine gun fire. The German attackers fought with extraordinary bravery. They knew that this was their last chance to win the battle. But the Americans had been preparing for this assault for days. They had laid minefields. They had dug additional anti-tank positions. They had pre-zeroed their artillery on the approaches to the ridge. The Germans were walking into a killing zone. The battle lasted for 3 days. On December 31st, the German attack finally broke. The 6th Panzer Army had suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed. Thousands of infantrymen were killed. The Germans had shot their bolt. They had no more reserves, no more offensive power, and no more hope of reaching Antwerp. Hodges had done what no one thought he could do. He had held the line. He had stopped the German offensive in its tracks. He had preserved the integrity of the American army and the Allied position in Europe. It was one of the greatest military achievements of the Second World War. And yet, when the battle was over, the world celebrated the relief of Bastogne and the heroic march of Patton's tanks. The men of the First Army, who had bled and died in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, were largely forgotten. General Hodges, the commander who had made it all possible, was barely mentioned. In the weeks that followed, Hodges continued to lead the First Army through the final months of the war. His soldiers pushed into Germany, captured more territory, and finally reached the Elbe River in May 1945, just as the war in Europe came to an end. But Hodges did not receive the accolades that went to Patton, Bradley, or Montgomery. He was simply the quiet soldier who had done his job and moved on. After the war, Hodges remained in the Army until his retirement in March 1949. He lived a quiet life in San Antonio, Texas. He went fishing, he played golf, he talked with old friends about the good old days, but he never wrote a memoir. He never defended his decisions in public. He never explained his side of the story. Some historians have criticized Hodges for his silence. They argue that he should have defended his reputation. They believe that he should have explained his decisions to the public. But perhaps Hodges understood something that they did not. Perhaps he knew that his legacy was not in his own words, but in the actions of his soldiers. The men of the First Army knew what he had done. They knew that he had saved their lives and the lives of their brothers in arms. That was enough for him. Hodges died on January 16, 1966, at the age of 78. Very few people outside the military community noticed. There were no public ceremonies. No one wrote a best-selling book about his life. He was buried in a quiet cemetery with only his family and a few old friends in attendance. Why did history remember Patton and forget Hodges? The answer lies in the nature of fame itself. Patton was a brilliant self-promoter. He understood the power of image, the art of the bold statement, the drama of the heroic leader. He cultivated relationships with journalists and photographers. He made sure that his actions were reported in the papers. He was, in many ways, the first modern celebrity general. Hodges, by contrast, had no interest in fame. He believed that soldiers should be seen as a team, not as individuals seeking glory. He avoided photographers. He gave few interviews. He never wrote a memoir. When journalists asked him to comment on his decisions, he often deflected the questions to his staff. He was, as one journalist described him, the general who refused to be a personality. But there was something else at work. Patton's death in December 1945, just months after the war, turned him into a legend. His diaries, which were published posthumously, gave the public an intimate look at his thoughts and emotions. He became a symbol of American aggressive spirit and the fighting determination that had won the war. Hodges, by contrast, lived quietly into the 1960s. He was not a martyr. He was not a character in a dramatic story. He was simply a competent soldier who had done his duty. There is no drama in quiet competence, and therefore no fame. What was Courtney Hodges' true contribution to the Allied victory? It was not simply the defense of the Elsenborn Ridge. It was the preservation of the United States Army as a fighting force during the worst crisis of the war. Consider the alternative. Suppose Hodges had retreated to the Meuse River. The Germans would have crossed the river and driven to Antwerp. The Allied armies would have been cut in half. The supply lines to the British and American forces would have been severed. The British Eighth Army would have been forced to retreat north, abandoning its positions. The Allies would have lost the war in Europe. Hodges' stand made it possible for Patton to relieve Bastogne. It made it possible for the British to hold the Meuse crossings. It made it possible for the entire Allied army to survive the worst German offensive since the beginning of the war. His decision to hold the northern shoulder was the single most important strategic decision of the Battle of the Bulge. And yet Hodges never received the recognition he deserved. He was not promoted to the rank of five-star general, the highest rank in the American military. He was never given a prominent post-war position. He simply retired to Texas and disappeared from history. Why does this matter? Because Hodges represents the kind of leadership that is essential to victory, but rarely celebrated. He was a leader who put the mission before his own reputation. He was a leader who understood the importance of holding the line, even when it was unpopular. He was a leader who did what was right, not what was easy. The Battle of the Bulge was the greatest battle of the American Army in World War II. It involved more than 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and countless aircraft. It lasted for more than a month and cost tens of thousands of lives. It was a desperate battle that the Allies had to win or lose everything. Courtney Hodges did not fight the war for medals. He did not fight for fame. He fought for his men. He stood in the path of the German offensive and said, "You will not pass." He gave his soldiers something to believe in, something to fight for. He gave them the confidence that they could hold the line. In the end, Hodges was right. He held the line. He stopped the German offensive. He saved the American army. He was a quiet soldier, a forgotten general, but a true hero. So the question remains, is the quiet leadership of Hodges more deserving of our admiration than the theatrical leadership of Patton? The answer is not simple. Both men contributed to the victory in different ways. Patton's aggressive, dramatic style was perfect for the sweeping offensives across France. Hodges' methodical, defensive approach was essential for holding the line when it mattered most. But perhaps we can learn something from Hodges' example. Perhaps it is time to remember the quiet soldiers, the forgotten generals, the men who did not seek fame, but who did their duty regardless. One thing is certain, the United States Army has never had a better reason to remember General Courtney H. Hodges. The legacy of Courtney Hodges extends beyond the Battle of the Bulge. His leadership style influenced the development of the American Army in the decades after World War II. The principles he used, careful planning, respect for the soldier, and the willingness to take responsibility for difficult decisions, became the foundation of modern American military leadership. But perhaps the most important lesson from Hodges' career is the value of humility. In a world that rewards self-promotion and aggressive self-advancement, Hodges reminds us that there is an alternative. He reminds us that true leadership is not about seeking fame or recognition. It is about serving a cause larger than oneself. Hodges' story is a reminder that history is not always written by the most famous participants. It is written by those who survive, those who document their actions, and those who tell their stories. The quiet soldiers may not be as celebrated as the dramatic leaders, but their contributions are just as essential. On January 25, 1945, the German offensive in the Ardennes was officially declared over. The Germans had failed. The Allied armies had survived the worst of Hitler's last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The final victory in Europe would come in May 1945. But the battle that made it possible was fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. And the man who made that victory possible was not George Patton, not Omar Bradley, and not Bernard Montgomery. It was General Courtney H. Hodges. Hodges lived out his years in quiet dignity, never seeking fame, never defending his actions, and never complaining about the credit he never received. He was a soldier who did his duty, and for him, that was enough. What do you think? Does history unfairly favor theatrical, self-promoting commanders like Patton while forgetting quiet, professional leaders like Hodges? Should we judge military leaders by their results or their personalities? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.